It's time to talk about Vray sun and sky. The way Vray sun and sky works is that it is trying to resemble the way sun and sky appear in real life. So basically, based on the position of the sun in the sky will try to adjust and mimic how the sky would look like in that specific time of day. So for example, at sunset, when sun is very close to the horizon line, the sky would be very orangish and the sun intensity and brightness would be less compared to noon, where the sun is at its highest point and the sky would be very blue and the sun would be very intense at the same time. So this real world behavior can be simply replicated using Vray sun and sky. Let's get into it and see how it works. As always, let me walk you through what we have in the scene. We have this tree, this bench, and hundreds of Vray proxies, which we'll be discussing later on, and how to kind of create Vray proxies and what is Vray proxy. But basically, right now they are representing a very beautiful grass field in the scene. Vray proxy basically imports geometry from an external mesh at render time. So the geometry is not present in the 3ds Max scene and does not take up any resources. Now, that's an interesting topic for another lesson, and also we have this 3ds Max physical camera. Now from the Vray toolbar, select Vray sun. You can start creating Vray sun from any view that you want. I prefer to start in the top view. That allows me to decide on the direction of the sun. So click and drag in the top view. Now Vray asks you whether to add a Vray sky environment map or not, and in most cases like now you should say yes. In the front view, you can decide on the elevation of the sun. As you increase its height, you go from sunset basically to noon. Let me roughly position the sun in the top and the front view. If I press 8 and go to my environment and effects window, you can see a procedural Vray sky map has been assigned as the environment map, and as we see in a few moments, it takes its appearance and colors from how we position the sun in the scene. Make sure the camera view is active and open up the render settings window. Change the target to active shade mode. Lock the view to render and start the render. As I'm changing the sun position in the front view, you can clearly see how, as I am getting closer to the horizon, the sun gets darker and the sky gets warmer and more orangish. And as I increase its height, we get a hotter sun and bluer sky. And as I move in between, you can see how dramatically the placement of the sun changes the lighting in the scene and affects how the sky looks. Also in the top view, I can go ahead and change the direction of the sun very easily. Perfect. Now let me put the sun where exactly I want it to be. So 6, 8, 7 on X, 6, 5, 2 on Y, and 2, 9, 6 on Z. Now let's select Vray sun and take a look at its parameters. First we have enabled, which turns the sun on and off. As I turn it off, you can see we still have our sky and we are only turning the sun off. Now let me make sure it's enabled. Next we have invisible. Right now we can see the sun in the scene. If I make it invisible, the sun is no longer visible in this scene, but it still affects the lighting and, as you can see, produce shadows. it is just invisible to the camera and reflections. So let me turn off invisible for the time being, so it's visible. Next we have affect diffuse, which determines whether the sun affects the diffuse portion of the materials or not. Then we have diffuse contribution. So if the sun affects the diffuse portion of the materials, how much it's going to be. At 1, the effect is 100%, and at 0, it's like disabling effect diffuse, and at, for example, 0.5, we are going to get an in-between effect. Let's set it back to 1 here. Then we have affect specular and specular contribution, whether the sun is affecting the specular reflection or not, and if so, by how much. So when I turn it off, you can see those visible specular highlights are gone from the grass field here. Now here, let's make sure it's enabled. Close the frame buffer window for the time being. Next, we have cast atmospheric shadows. To see the effect a bit better, let me change the position of the sun a bit. 1153 on X, 651 on Y, and 295 on Z. Also, we need an atmospheric effect in the scene. Press 8 to open up the environment and effects window. In the atmosphere rollout, add the Vray environment fog. Set the fog distance to something like 60 centimeters and fog height to 100 centimeters. In the render setting, make sure the sampler is progressive and set 5 minutes as the render time limit. Now let me open up the frame buffer and show you 2 renders with and without cast atmospheric shadows enabled. In the first render, it's disabled, and in the second one, it is enabled. As you can see, when it's enabled, the shadows are more pronounced, especially the atmospheric shadows. Now open up the environments and effects window and make sure Vray environment fog is inactive. Close all these windows, select the sun and put it back to where it was before. So I think it was 687 on X, 652 on Y, and 295 or 296 on Z. Maybe this time we can put it a little lower on Z so we can see the effects of parameters like turbidity a bit better. So let's set the height to 155 centimeters. And let's run the active shade again. Next, we have turbidity that controls the amount of pollution, dust, and particles in the sky. Lower values like 2 would result in cleaner sky. And as you increase this value to something like 5, you can see the sky gets more polluted. A value of 10 would make the effect to be very extreme. Let me put it back to 2.5, which is the default value, so we can get our clear sky back. Then we have ozone, which controls the color of the sunlight. By default, it's set to 0.35, and you can alter this value from 0 to 1. At 0, you get a bit more of a yellowish, orangish tone, and at 1, you would get cooler and bluer sunlight. It's a bit hard to see the effect of this parameter in this particular scene, but let me show you a few renders. In the first render, ozone was set to 0. And in the second render, it was set to 1. And in the third render, it was set to 0.35, which is the default value. If you pay attention to the grass fields and also the leaves up here, you can clearly see that warmer, yellower tone when the ozone is set to 0, and it gets cooler and bluer when it's set to 1. And in the third render, we get something in between those two renders. In this case, let's set the ozone value to something like 0.1. Now let's run the Vray RT again. Next, we have intensity multiplier, which controls the intensity or brightness of the sun. If I set it to something like 3, you can see the sun gets a lot brighter. And if set to something like 0.2 here, it gets a lot darker. Let's set it back to 1 maybe. Then we have size multiplier, which controls the size of the visible sun. Now, to see the effect of this parameter a bit better, let's change the elevation of the sun back to 295 centimeters. Now let me stop Vray RT here. To see the sun disk here again a bit better, go to the render setting and in the Vray tab, come down to the color mapping rollout. Make sure the burn value is something like 0.2. And now we should be able to see the sun disk a bit better. So let's run active shade again. And as you can see, the sun disk is clearly visible. Size multiplier affects two things mainly. One is the size of the visible sun and the sharpness of its shadows. If I increase the size multiplier to something like 5 here, you can see the sun disk gets bigger and the shadows getting diffuser. Let's set the size to something like 10. Now even bigger with more diffuse shadows. Let's set it back to 1 so we can have our sharp realistic shadows back. Filter color changes the color of the sun based on the color mode. So when the color mode is set to filter and I alter the filter color, let's select maybe a pinkish color here, you can see the color of the sun is shifted towards this particular color. When the color mode is set to direct, you can see only the color of the visible sun disk is changing. Let's set the intensity multiplier to 0.2 so you can see the sun itself a bit better. And in this mode, the position of the sun in the sky does not affect its intensity. So if I change the height to something like 900 centimeters, even though the color of the sky has changed, but the sun has the same intensity. Let's place the sun at 295 centimeters again. The override mode is like the direct mode, but in this mode, the intensity of the sun does depend on its position. So let's set the filter color back to white and change the color mode to filter and make the intensity, maybe let's set it to 1 again. Next we have shadow subdivs, which controls the quality of the shadows produced by the sun. Now right now, if you go ahead and actually increase the subdiv parameter to 8, 64, 128 and try to see any differences in the quality of your shadows, you might not be able to kind of see that because it really depends. Whenever you see the subdiv number, it really depends on the kind of global DMC settings and sampler settings. So it's a very important discussion that we're going to be having it. But I think it's just enough for the timing to understand that by increasing the subdivs in certain situations, you are going to get higher quality shadows. Then we have shadow bias, which moves the shadow towards or away from the shadow casting objects. We worked with this parameter when we were discussing area lights, and it's exactly the same thing here. Then we have photon emit radius, which is this green cylinder in the scene, and controls the radius of the area where photons would be shot when using caustics effects in the scene. This is like the target and emit radius of the dome light, and since we haven't discussed caustics yet, let's move on for the moment. Then we have sky model, which determines the procedural model to generate Vray sky texture. We have 4 models. I hope I'm pronouncing them the right way. We have Pritham, and we have CIE clear, CIE overcast, and Hosek. Let me go ahead and hide all the objects in the scene except for the Vray sun and the camera. Now let's change the height of the sun to 900 centimeters, and let's go through these models again and see how they differ. Set this to Hosek, and notice as I decrease the sun's elevation from 900 how the model is responding and changing the appearance of the sky. So let's try 800, 700 centimeter, 600, 500, 400, 300, 200, 100, 75. Now we are getting closer to sunset. 50, or sunrise, 25, 5, and 1. Perfect. Let's set it back to 295 and unhide everything. There isn't any rule or preference to use which model. It's totally artistic and depends on the scene and your taste. Next, we have indirect horizontal illumination, which is for legacy purposes and specifies the intensity of the illumination on horizontal surfaces coming from the sky. We have ground albedo, which determines the color of the ground in the Vray sky. So let me kind of hide everything except for the camera and the Vray sun again. And as I change the ground albedo color, you can see the color of the ground is changing in the sky model. Blend angle controls the size of the gradient formed by the Vray sky between the horizon and the actual sky. The default value is 5.739, and as I decrease it to something like 1, for example, this gradation becomes smaller, and if I increase it to maybe 25, it becomes larger. And finally, we have the horizon offset, and it lets you to offset the horizon. Let's set it back to 0 again. And finally, the exclude button, which works like in normal Vray lights. Let me unhide everything and stop the active shade. Finally, if I open up Material Editor and Environment and Effects window, we can take a look at the actual texture that controls the sky. So let me instance the environment map to the Material Editor. So this is our Vray sky texture. As you can see at the moment, its parameters are grayed out because they are being controlled based on the sun's position. Let's run the Vray RT quickly here. Now, if I enable specify sun node, I can go ahead using the sunlight option, define the Vray sun that I want to work with. So let's pick the Vray sun that we have in the scene, or it can be a secondary Vray sun in the scene that you have. Now I can change these parameters here. Maybe let's set the turbidity to 10. And as you can see, in real time, we can see the changes in the RT. Okay, let's set it back to 2.5 and untick specify sun node. So we are back where we were, and let's close all these windows. Let me quickly prepare for our final render. So let's stop the active shade here, open up render settings and change the target to production mode. Set the render size to 1600 by 1200 or whatever you want. Change the image sampler to bucket. Let me set the max subdivs to 50 and noise thresholds to 0.007. In the GI tab, set the irradiance map to medium and light cache subdivs to 1000. And as always, add Vray denoiser and set its preset to mild. Even though after the render is finished and the Vray denoiser takes its effect, you can actually come back. You can come back here and change the preset to other presets here, to strong, for example, and hit the update button, and you can see the result immediately, which is very great. Now I have two final renders, and in the second render, the sun's position is 243 on X, 651 on Y, and 59 centimeters on Z. Now let's take a look at the results. This is our first render, quite beautiful and gorgeous. Let's do some quick color corrections here. Maybe open up corrections control, enable white balance, and let's make the scene a bit warmer by casting out some blue. Maybe 8500 would do just fine. This would be enough, but if you are looking for more of a dramatic effect, let's enable color balance and enable shadows and make them a bit bluer, maybe about 0.15. Select the highlights or enable it, and let's make the highlights a bit warmer, maybe negative 0.5. Then we can go ahead and save your render. And for the second render, let's just enable the white balance and make it a bit warmer, maybe 7700. And I can save this render, I guess, right now. We can continue with the color correction and save another version later on, but right now this is a nice render. Let me enable curve correction. Now let's try replicating a classic sunset shot. Select the first point and try lowering its tangents until you get a silhouette of the foreground objects, and this would be a nice render too. Perfect. Finally, let's open the lens effect setting. Make sure you enable these effects before hitting the render, or you would be forced to re-render to be able to kind of see how these effects affect your render. Uncheck interactive and enable bloom and change its weight and size to 2 and 20. Enable glare and set its weight to 3 and size to 15. And now you can click on the update button. There you guys, you can see very beautiful sunset image. Maybe you can go ahead and actually do the same thing in Photoshop, and you can work on it as you wish. So in this lesson, we discussed Vray sun and sky, and I will see you in the next lesson.